Welcome, friends, to yet one more fabulous installment edition of the Regeneration Podcast. Michael Martin, I'm going to begin with a question for you about an author we have in common, Nicholas Berdyaev. You know something about him, don't you?
Yes.
Okay.
I think he's one of my masters.
Okay. Do you know? All these Silver Age theologians, a lot of them were in engagement with a lesser read guy because he was not in anywhere connected with orthodoxy. Do you know the name Vasily Rozanov?
No, I don't.
Okay. These guys, they would have said maybe he was the greatest prose writer of that generation. He was one of these people. Our guest, who we'll be introducing shortly, mentioned, a hero of mine, John Cowper Powys. And Rozanov struck me as like him. He had a fascination with matter. His great symbols were like blood, even semen, and so forth. But he wrote a seminal essay, and I think it might frame some of our conversation that when we invite our guest. It was called, and Berdyaev wrote an essay that you can find online. The essay was called "Sweet Jesus and the Bitter Fruits of the World," and it's such an interesting idea, right? That we love Jesus so much. Jesus is so sweet that everything else becomes dried husks. And Vasily Rozanov, who loved the world, he was a sensate. I've never seen a picture of him, but I know he had rounded features, and he was just engaged with the world. So he was, and hyper perceptive. And he would have thought that, he was saying, especially when we think of, again, Russia, mater, the mother, materialism, this whole Russian genius with it. Yeah. He brought that Russian genius and he coined this framing, sweet Jesus and the bitter fruits of the world. And it instantly changes, for me, the way we think about a lot of things. We can be so churchy with Jesus that we forget, our show, Regeneration, of politics, of agriculture, of economics.
Well,
go ahead.
Well, that's Berdyaev's thing, right? Is that academia and theology turns a wild animal into a domesticated animal. And I think we do the same thing with Jesus. We've domesticated him, right? Because of theology and etc. You domesticate the religious experience, religious activity, right?
Yeah. I think Chesterton kind of said the same thing too in many of his ways, right? So that's it. We'll keep it wild, and we'll come back to that idea many times. But I just thought, what a neat way to say, what we're exploring in this Regeneration podcast. So our guest this afternoon, and we're so glad to have him, is Dominic D'Souza. Dominic is the editor, we'll call it. We'll have him introduce ourselves, of Smart Catholics. And Smart Catholics it's a blog. It's kind of a clearinghouse of information and his ideas and so forth. But welcome, Dominic. And don't shorten this. Tell people about yourself before we kind of bring you into a conversation and grill you with some questions.
Oh, thank you. No, honestly, you gents should just keep right on going. I mean, I love listening to the show, and I've started listening to it from scratch all over again. I've read your books, and Mike, I've been following your blog and just sort of working backwards and trying to understand how you think and all. And as you mentioned, I'm the founder of Smart Catholics, because 3 years ago, I got so sick and tired of what I was seeing online, and kind of felt Catholics needed a new place to connect, sort of a home away from Facebook. And that then continued to grow as I began to realize making just another social network, it kind of perpetuates the problem. What we need is fresh leadership. And I'm hungry and looking for people with specific outlooks and specific voices, because I've been going on my own journey. So I've titled myself Learner-in-Chief at Smart Catholics, because I have no degrees. I'm a hobbyist, read a book a week kind of thing, trying to understand all of the stuff that was not given to me by hook or by crook growing up. So my day job is in branding and design, and that ended up emerging out of a love of storytelling. I loved writing novels, and actually I've got a whole brand on the side for writing stories and helping other people do that. That comes, I think, back to something that is very core to me, is wanting to understand the story of everything. So once you get that, everything else falls into place in my mind. So part of my conversion journey was growing up as a radical traditionalist, very fringe kind of cult, and then stepping away from that in the last 10 years and realizing, as I said just before the call, I need new axioms for life, and I'm not exactly sure what they are. And that's one of the reasons why Michael, you said in a couple of episodes back on regeneration how reading Tomberg just redefined your sense of what the word Catholic meant, to incorporate so much more, and reading that, the definition of Hermeticism and so on, that helped me to see this is what needs to be rediscovered. And I don't know where this goes. I don't know who else out there thinks like this or is doing this. So I'm going to start my own sort of just journey, reading, trying to understand, because there is so much I don't. And I see nothing in terms of professional Catholic circles that are also thinking along these same lines. So
Well,
very much learner in chief here.
I think what I tell me if this is your experience, but where I became disenfranchised with the Catholic media / social media is it's all apologetics all the time, and no, intellectual engagement or conversation. It's just bum, 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 bum.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Which it's okay, but it's not very nourishing.
I'm embarrassed to say I don't even know what's out there. Like I would say, Michael, I called you and mentioned this podcast without even knowing like what other people are doing. But it's good to hear, I mean, from somebody like Dominic who understands media.
I live 20 miles away from the headquarters of Ave Maria Radio.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
And actually, I've visited the bookstore. It's actually at Domino's Farms, owned by Tom Monahan.
Sure.
The greatest Catholicism money can buy. So it permeates the culture around here. It's really all over the place. And it's not horrible, but it's apologetics. And then only goes so far, it doesn't, you look back, and if you think in Catholic history to the great moments of culture in Catholic history, even, you mentioned Tomberg, but I would go, to
describe for people who Tomberg is. I know we mentioned him, but it's funny because we've done an episode on Steiner. We talk about Blake and like really unpack it. A quick Tomberg bio, Mike. Or there's a new biography out on him. I saw, but
I just got it.
The Lenten Tomberg and the monumental work Meditations in the Tarot. Right?
Yeah. Well, Valentin Tomberg had been he was an Estonian or Russian esotericist who got into anthroposophy and eventually found his way into the Catholic Church and wrote probably one of the more miraculous, amazing books of the 20th century in Catholic.
Maybe miraculous is a key word, right?
It's the Meditations on the Tarot. Oh. And in a few weeks, we'll be interviewing Robert Powell, who translated that book into English in early 1980s. And I was just remembering, gosh, get this, back in the day, I don't know how I came into it, but I came into a manila folder with some of the uncorrected proofs. I don't even call them proofs, uncorrected manuscript of Meditations on the Tarot from Robert Powell.
Huh.
And I gave it to a friend of mine. I don't know why I did that, but it was kind of it would be an interesting thing.
Like, what do you mean? What do you mean? You came in like there was just a big file you found that had like.
Well, I got it at a bookstore.
Yeah.
And I was like, wow, what's this? And I bought it, or I think I can't remember how it worked.
Yeah.
Somebody gave it to me, and I gave it to a friend of mine.
And you're saying this is like, these are the words that like Tomberg himself typed out on a page or something?
No, these were the words that Robert Powell typed out on the page.
Gotcha. Okay, yeah.
No, yeah, I think the Tomberg's original manuscript might be. Well, I think
like the Dead Sea Scrolls of modern esotericism, right?
No, I think Robert Powell has the original. At least he did.
Yeah,
because somebody gave it to him to translate. But I think if we look at Catholic culture, intellectual culture, there are great moments of it. And I think in the 20th century with Hans Urs von Balthasar in the Communio Circle, and he on the back here, I just happen to have it right here, my copy of Meditations on the Tarot that I bought in 1985 when it came out, and there's an endorsement from Hans Urs von Balthasar on the back, and actually he wrote
the afterword
to the German edition, which and the recent edition by Angelical Press it's in. But that was an interesting moment with von Balthasar and Henri de Lubac and Théodore de Chardin. They're all friends, and they were doing something pretty remarkable in theology, you know. And
so, quick interjection. I spent the whole weekend zooming in to a von Balthasar conference that was hosted in Rochester, New York. It's the 50th anniversary of Communio.
Yeah.
Present in Rochester was Jean-Luc Marion,
Yeah.
all the heavy hitters. Tracy Rowland flew in from Australia.
Did she?
Yeah, and I'll have to. Boy, I have a lot to say about what I heard, but continue. I mean, it was wild.
I think that was an important moment, and
it was.
If you looked at the agrarian movement in literature in America, that was, you know, with that was an important moment. Mm-hmm. In Catholic letters. I mean, even if he's kind of a fringe person because he's not Catholic, but T.S. Eliot,
for sure,
or Brother Antoninus, mm-hmm. William Everson. I mean, there were so many cool things happening in the middle of the 20th century in Catholic letters and in thinking. And it's, in the meantime, it's been, you know, kind of, you know, squelched and turned into apologetics. And there's not really anything remotely like that. And in fact, the reason I started Jesus the Imagination was because there's nothing like that. You know, I don't know if I succeeded there, but that was the impulse behind it, is come on, guys.
Yeah.
There's got to be something.
So tell us more then, Dominic. You know, like, do you feel like naming the organization you grew up in, and like, how did you find it stifling? We're not looking to like badmouth anything, but, you know, start telling your story.
Okay. You mentioned, Michael, like the amount of apologetics that's out there. And I think it's because it got first to the table with online media. But that's actually a very deep part of my background. My dad himself is an apologist. That's kind of been his bread and butter since forever. And we've moved all over the world. Like, I was born in New Zealand. He was from Brazil. My mom was from California. And then,
what's your dad's name?
Raymond D'Souza. He lives.
Oh, yeah, I've seen it. Yeah,
up near you, New York.
Yeah.
And he lived in South Africa and Canada for a while, and then, you know, New Zealand. We then grew up in Australia, lived for a year in France, a couple of months in Fiji, and then now settled in the United States. And it's just funny how things end up shaking out. We were on the sort of the fringe of this cult, never truly accepted. And the group is called Tradition Family Property, very apocalyptical, elitist, very anti-Vatican II, very radical traditionalist, that sort of thing, like right on the edge, you know, with like Society of Pius X, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And we were never like completely accepted into it. So we always were fighting for acceptance because there was something a bit different, or just battles with the hierarchy or whatever. So in my growing up, I was always trying to be the good little soldier and reading the foundational documents of this group more than things like the Catechism or sacred scripture or anything. And then came one point where I think it was just literally dating my wife, who then became my wife, started to open up things. She just asked. It's
kind of adultery that's not adultery. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah. She just asked simple little questions, or it was just her presence, you know. Yeah. And as a sidebar, just this past week, Jonathan Pajot, his brother Pajot, and Jordan Peterson had a wonderful conversation about Genesis and so on, and they made this amazing comparison, or how do you call it? Exploration of the role of Adam and the role of Eve, and how the role of Adam, his job primarily is to name things, to be the one who creates the theories, the one who delineates and defines, and so on, the one who impresses the order. But Eve's role is to be the receptive one who communicates with the things that are being named, who speaks with those fringes and allows them to come back, and she provides that loving admonition, that loving argument, not to destroy, but to make what is being built, stronger. And in my case, that's what was starting to happen to me from the inside. And the Pope Francis had just been elected, and this was the first time I'd ever really taken a Pope seriously or started paying attention to him. Up until that point, the Holy Fathers were always sidelined or put down. And then I remember there being one day where I realized I just got stuck. I realized I would have to be smarter than the Pope to decide if I could accept what he had to say or not. And I could never imagine doing that. I wouldn't live long enough. So I was then stuck because, of course, I'm now making myself the Pope, or at least that's sort of the attitude. So I started reading. One of the things that really kind of pushed me to rethink a lot of the things that I'd come to understand was actually archaeology. And we grew up watching Indiana Jones, so I loved that sort of thing. And I was introduced to Graham Hancock and all of his research about all of the ancient pyramids and how fascinating this stuff is. And so I started following and reading his writing, trying to understand what this meant, because it doesn't fit the timeline that traditionalist Catholicism and materialist Catholicism follows. And he's just making not these assumptions, but these conclusions that didn't make any sense at all. Fast forward a couple of years later, and I'm reading Language of Creation by Jonathan Pageau and his brother, Mathieu. Discovered Michael's work through somebody sharing something about the Green Man. And I was one of those kids, again, reading constantly and loving adventure and fairies and so on, desperately wishing they were real. And then to that article.
They are.
Yeah. Well, there you go.
I was going to go there, but it's okay.
We'll get there.
Yep.
But Michael, you're a post about the Green Man. I did not understand. I wanted to understand how that could be, because there was something echoed and was just resonating. So I went and I bought your books and have been started reading them. And that's when I discovered, Richard Rohr, Cynthia Bourgeault, and then fell into Tomberg and decided I have no idea who this Steiner is that he keeps referring to. And after reading the Tarot and Lazarus Come Forth, some of these others, I need to dig into Steiner and start getting into that. And of course, Michael, as you said, it's a completely different world. And pushing into that, reading things like Teilhard de Chardin, Rupert Sheldrake's also been, so I'm discovering this galaxy of people challenging this silly, flattened materialist viewpoint, allowing the reintegration, the re-enchanting of creation, and so I'm kind of at a point where I'm skidding around. I feel like building a fresh framework that's so completely different to how I grew up, but I feel like it's like that, slipping into that Eve mode of what are all of the fringes that have been ignored as the West and as Catholicism has doubled down on the apologetics of clear, definitions. What are all of the more mystical and intuitive and courses of exploration and discovery and so on, that the church has not integrated for a variety of reasons, maybe no ill intention involved. I'm so far calling it maybe the Western digression, the Western hiatus, as we're now reintegrating things like the patristics. And Vatican II gives us, or I should maybe say endorses at large, a framework for how to integrate or deal with or dialogue with all of the other traditions. And then this just rush of beauty and this discovery of all of these lost traditions. And I'll kind of wrap in a second. What's so funny, I find, for me, is the rabid fear of modernism growing up. Everything was like modernist, Masonic, Gnostic, that's anything terrible or bad. Of course, those are the usual culprits.
Take the anti-modernist oath.
And then I go and I read stuff like Tomberg and Steiner and Teilhard and Powys now, who sits in my mind right between Teilhard and Steiner.
What are you reading from Powys? I mean, talk about an unwieldy corpus. It's almost Steinerian. Go ahead.
Well, I'm forgetting his title. It's that one book that he did on the Complex Vision.
Oh yeah, it's wild, isn't it?
Through because you recommended it.
Yeah.
I tell you, it's hard reading. The easiest parts are when he sort of waxes rhetorical, and then it's easier, but it's powerful. Like
is.
I'm looking at this and I'm intensely frustrated because I spent 1 year at Christendom College, and I think there's a lot of good that's often done and tries to be done. But I read all of these things, the things that I've been reading, and I'm like, how is this not some kind of more easily digestible course on all of these things? These things should be whatever. Catholic philosophy, like 101, whatever, to re-engage with the real. Anyhow, coming back to modernism. What I find hilarious is we were terrified of modernists coming in and maintaining the surface level of the words and then changing all of the meanings. And today, we're so adamant, we preserve the plain and obvious intention of what the church means to teach. But then you go and you sort of swap out your axioms, you swap out your ruling vision, and the words all stay the same, and you go back to the ancient wisdom traditions and realize maybe this is why the church is so reticent to define things with the kind of clarity that everybody begs for, because her mind and her heart is more on these, coming out of these wisdom traditions, and the rest of us have absolutely no idea what that is. So we're the modernists, and we need to rediscover what Margaret Barker, is putting back into the limelight, what sociology. And like I said, I'm just listing off stuff just because these last 10 years feel like a university course of just constant immersion. And now I'm trying to synthesize or trying to understand, and hence following you all and chatting with you.
So the thing that comes to mind, and in fact, I was talking about this with my students this week because in this one class, because the text for these 2 or 3 weeks is Ivan Illich's ABC.
ABC, the alphabetization of the Western mind. I've read it at least 6 times. Yeah,
which it's wonderful, and the students are really into it. It's a challenging text for undergrads, but it's important because it makes us think about what is the role of literacy, right?
Yep.
And it's complicated because I have a PhD in English, so I'm totally into the literacy project, but what is it that happens with becoming literate? And part of it is the socialization or mass formation project. And so you go to public school, or you go to a traddy school, and you get the company line, right? You get these are the things we're pushing for. This is what all the reading material is leading you to this end, right? Mm-hmm. And very little of it is leading you to a relationship with the real. So if you're at a public school, and I was surprised because I'm 60 and my students are, I think in this class they're probably 19 or 20, and I was asking them what books they read in high school, and they were the same books I read in high school.
The Great Gatsby,
The Great Gatsby. I was
To Kill a Mockingbird, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, it's the same stuff that they've been doing for 50 years.
Yeah,
and I was kind of stunned. And there's nothing wrong with those books. I think they're great books too. But and I asked them when I left them today, I said, I want you guys to think, because we just started fall break. I said, think about this. What is education for? And especially for those of you who want to go into education, what could it be? Because I think that's part of what Illich is doing in his project, mm-hmm. is asking us to interrogate our own assumptions and interrogate the structures within which we find ourselves. And it's interesting though. So Dominic was mentioning how when the internet first got going, it was the apologetics. It was like that's the first wave. But I also think, and I think you see this in Rod Dreher, right?
Who's moving to Hungary?
Is he?
That's what I heard.
Well, the apologetic
it strikes me as crazy, by the way. Go
impulse. Ahead. He's got trouble. I feel sorry for the guy. I do not dislike him, but the apologetic emphasis is about getting it right. You gotta get it. It's drill sergeant theology in a way, right? Making sure everybody gets it right. But if you look through history, whenever the church called for what do you call it? A council, it was because they were freaked out that people weren't getting it right. So if you go back to what was the one, the Lateran Council, which is when they tightened up the Eucharist, when they decided that the faithful didn't need to get the holy blood, right? Because we got to straighten things up here. And then with Trent, they're like, okay, you got a Reformation, we're going to give you a counter Reformation. Okay, so it's all about tightening up the ship and laying down the law again. And then Vatican I, Vatican II, the same thing, right? They're usually born out of panic by the administrative class, or the elite class, you could say, right? Because if you think about this, throughout most of Catholic history, the laity, the peasantry, kind of moved along ignorant of what was going on with church politics. They did their festivals, they did their May days, they did the liturgy, they were totally into the Catholic way of living. But then the Reformation comes and says, well, you can't do that, that's not Christian. And then there's the pushback, and eventually, and as I'm trying to think who it was that's mentioned this, but what happened from the Counter-Reformation is that the Catholic Church itself became more Protestant.
For sure it did.
So, and to me, I think there's more Catholicism in the poetry of Robert Herrick, who is an Anglican priest, than most Catholic theology since the 17th century, because it's based on really communio, not an intellectual, seminar system, but it's really about the community and how you do Catholicism. How do you do it? In an authentic relationship to the real. How do you do that? Rather than, well, do we have the rules right? Let's, those people who are like, I can't really do this right now because it says here. And lived experience will teach you that the way to that. And it's interesting. I mentioned that I gave a talk at Cambridge University a couple weeks ago, and it was on Pavel Florensky. Even though I was by Zoom. And the first sentence of Pavel Florensky's monumental book, The Pillar and Ground of the Truth, is, in fact, it's right here. I don't have to remember. I can tell you what it says. And so what it says is, living religious experience is the sole legitimate way to gain knowledge of the dogmas.
Yeah, shouldn't that be so self-evident? Right.
That is how I'd like to express the general theme of my book, right? And I think, and I never got that. I don't know about you, but I went through Catholic school. Catholic school was 13 of the best, years of my life. Catholic high school was 6 of the best years of my life. But I didn't get that, and I was definitely a person who hungered for that. And I would, when in religion classes or catechism, I would always ask those questions, and we're not interested in that right now. We're talking about sin. I said, well, I know the ways to sin. tell me how to know Jesus by not sinning. Okay, fine. You see what I'm talking about, right? We've, and that to me seems an authentic, what Florensky's talking about there is an authentic way into a religious life that short circuits the manualist, and you can call it the manualist, but you can just call it, the left hand of the catechism approach.
That's what I've been lately calling, again, the disease of religion, which Jesus came to cure, right? Like this thing where we memorize some formulas, tightening the ship, this thing that can be just clearly handed on. I think we can only see the position we're in and the urgency of us getting out of this position for sanity. I'm basically a one-trick pony on like the mental health of young people. Right. But, we're now reaping the fruits of giving people this religion, and it's really dangerous to the mind. It's not religious experience, it's religion.
And we can't apologetics our way out of this trouble.
No. And your favorite whipping boy, Michael. Yeah, right.
Well, it's like, the old joke, I cut this pipe off 3 times and it's still too short, right? That's kind of apologetics.
Yeah. So this sounds like it mirrors your journey, Dominic. Kind of share, what you've discovered. And you said you've just been reading so much, a book a week. Maybe it's like, what are the questions? Not that Michael and I would have answers. What's surfacing for you? Because I think your journey is emblematic in one sense. It's funny that you mentioned the names. Dan Horan is on your website, and Richard Rohr. And after a while, I had a Rohr phase, and I can't say that he's not there. Like, I can read his books with profit. Mm-hmm. At this von Balthasar conference I mentioned, and when I read Richard Rohr, like anything, we need a tripartite anthropology back, right? Body, soul, and spirit. And that's crucial to Steiner. It's a seminal moment in history where he says, and yet this von Balthasar conference was just talking about body and soul all the time. And it left me dry. And I wonder tell me if I have a too simple understanding of Rohr, but he's got all these Fowlers, and they identify as like, our path is non-dualistic. And maybe Bourgeois was a little bit like that. And I'm not trying to tie a tripartite anthropology to non-dualism, but I think non-dualism can only take us so far, right? What is Rohr doing now? I know he's so popular. I wonder why he leaves me dry. I was once at a conference, the diocese invited all these big names to give what's called the ministerium, the roster diocese. And it's, all the priests and laity who work for the church. And two of the big names were able to say yes, so they had them both. One was Timothy Radcliffe, who was the leader of the Dominicans at the time. And I had just been named to run my parish as a layman, and Timothy Radcliffe put me at ease. He wrote a book on like why we go to mass or something, but he also stood in front of people. The shirt was untucked like mine always is. His fly could have been down. And he said, I think we need to, he was just thinking out loud, and it was very humorous. I think we just need to like let things die. And I thought that was very freeing. Richard Rohr got up there and he was very intense, and he was almost like giving us another program that like, we're all dumb because we can't get the non-dualism thing. And he almost seemed angry, but and I've read a lot of books, but tell me so go through some of your heroes, and Pope Francis too, I love him. And then he seems to be his own worst enemy sometimes. Start reflecting on some of these heroes or these people who have jumped out to you,
I mean, in that you're asking a type 5 to you're just giving him carte blanche. So I'm probably going to throw that back and say I need more guardrails here. But let me just speak briefly to Rohr. I can't speak to his whole corpus, everything he's written. I've only read a couple. His one book where he wrote, what was it? The Naked Now, Seeing How the Mystics See. I read that 10 years ago, and that was, I think it was the book that really kicked me along my journey. Because I didn't know what I was doing at the time. Yeah. And what that opened up, it softened me towards this understanding that there is a mystical, through direct experience of Christ and the saints and the angelic and the spiritual and so on, that is not only as valid as what you get from the pulpit and the canon, whatever, but it's almost more valid because it's the necessary feminine corrective to the all too abstract, amen, of the masculine tendency that, and I had never read anything as, rigorously in love with the mystical side of the church. And so, like I said, that softened me towards what have I been missing my whole life? Because I used to hate the catechism, I confess. It was boring. I was a kid. I wanted to play and have fun, draw superheroes and so on. I used to hide the catechism book, behind the TV in the living room.
Was it that children's Baltimore Catechism, the gray and red one?
It might have been, but it was like large and maroon, and it had
that was the Baltimore Catechism.
Okay, probably. We had that everywhere.
Yeah.
Now I'm reading Bentley Hart and thanks to your recommendation, Michael, Kino Gaia, which just blew me away. Now I'm reading Bentley Hart a lot more seriously, and it's so beautiful. I'm at such a loss at how hopeful and how beautiful an antidote this is to the rigorism, the legalism, the elitism. And I think this is one of the things that I'm learning how to do, is one, to be a lot more forgiving to myself and to my past, and understand that stuff like tribalism in the church is just a standard human response to anything. We have the truth. You can't because we have to, and so you draw lines and kill those who don't fit in and so on, or isolate them and censor them. that's just a normal human thing. Cult is when you take that tribal need for belonging and then you elevate it into a form of spiritual abuse and apocalypticism. And we see that happening everywhere. I mean, this is kind of been my trouble, is leaving one cult and then kind of falling into another, or being afraid of that, and now seeing them in a way almost everywhere, because I don't know what the cause could be necessarily, but you have, cults within families, within parishes, of personalities and so on. They happen online, they happen at the state level, the country level, and so on.
This is really good, using the word cult to get at some of this. I've been talking to a guy recently, and I know he listens to this, but he would say back in the day, Steubenville, I think it was different than it is now, but he had gone from a true cult, whether it was Hare Krishnas. They started dating a girl, and it was Steubenville, and a certain form of that said, I just joined another cult, right? But you've got a nose for this, it sounds like.
Well, there was a really good video. I'm not sure if I can remember it. Anyhow, there's a good video online, and I can send it to you afterwards, that just showed how, humans start by being tribes, and we do tribes for everything. Everything is a tribe. Mm-hmm. But then cult is when you get spiritual about it. And if you're not in, you're in hell. And anyhow, so coming back to Rohr, like I said, I've read only a couple of his books and so on, and I've watched a host of his videos and so on. He is pushing, I think, the non-dual line very strongly at first blush. And I think that there are a lot of people who cotton on because he is Franciscan and Catholic, but they hear him echoed in, they hear themselves echoed in what he says, because he is, he's so easily able to recognize the good in native religions, in paganism, or in Wicca, in Buddhism, and
great.
So on.
Yeah,
and he can speak to all these, and people are not used to Catholic influences doing that. And of course, a lot of these traditions are non-dualist, and so everybody's chanting and so on. But you keep watching him, you keep reading him, and he will consistently say, you have to learn to be non-dualist so that you can reintegrate. And again, come back to that tripartite. You can only be truly, in that sense, non-dualist from the third point of view. And then there is that reintegration back into the whole thing. Stop dividing everything into two pieces. And most people don't get that far.
And I have to wonder, I mean, the kind of dualism we're talking about here was probably always implicit, would be always easy to think of creation in those terms. But after Descartes, it became, not only did it become emphasized, but it also became the cause of secularism, right? Unintended, but that's what it was. And which is why, my period in literary studies is the 17th century in particular, and that's when the push against the pure nature came out, which is what de Lubac was all about in Surnaturel, which is why he got the curse, he got the papal curse for that one. But he was right. And John Milbank, I think John Milbank wrote this little book on de Lubac. It's called The Suspended Middle. I think it's fantastic.
Brilliant book.
And interestingly enough, if you look into the 17th century, I mentioned it before on this podcast, but thinkers that are now called Hermetic thinkers or occult thinkers like Robert Flood or Henry Vaughan or Thomas Vaughan or Paracelsus, they were rejecting that call it societal or cultural dualism that was being foisted upon Christendom at the time, because they thought that was antithetical to what it is to be Christian, right? And I've written about this in just about every book I've written. But on this, by the same token, I think it's important that, as Mike mentioned, one of Rudolf Steiner's main points of emphasis is in the tripartite anthropology of the spirit, soul, and the body. And if you think of it in those terms, I mean, it's much more healthy. Because if you ask people, I mean, any Christians, but in particular Catholics, what the difference between the spirit and the soul are, they cannot tell you. Generally speaking, they can't come up with a thing. They don't know the difference. Now, I don't think it's true that, as Steiner posits, that it's some council in the middle is the spirit was exiled.
You mean the
Catholic
Fourth
theology.
Council of Constance or whatever in 869?
Yeah.
It's like a hinge point for Steinerites, Dominic. You know,
And
that
I don't
they
think that happened. I mean, I don't think that's true, but
I've
but
read
I
a
do
lot
think
into it that I think you can see things in
it
history.
is true.
Yeah. Oops. I think you froze up there
Well,
a
you
little
can
bit,
see
Michael.
with nominalism, right?
Okay. Yeah.
You can see with nominalism that started to show up, right? And then, am I frozen still?
No, not anymore.
Okay,
Oh.
good. Yes, nominalism, and that goes back to the Middle Ages. Things start to get really sketchy with the way we think of Christian anthropology, and it becomes reductive to soul and spirit, or soul and body.
Yeah. Let me phrase this question then another way, and this would show my ignorance. I think I've probably read like 6 or 7 Rohr books and saw him talk. But is there so if we say, that Buddhism has a non-dualism, can we make a distinction between like a world affirming non-dualism and a world negating non-dualism, or is non-dualism non-dualism? I guess I probably have this bias that a non-dualism ends up being kind of world denying and doesn't necessarily take us to the real. Tell me, Dominic.
I don't know that I could answer it sufficiently for you.
Yeah.
So knowing some of his sources indicates to me that I think he knows a lot more than he lets on, and he will simplify things a lot, as dense as he often is, but he will simplify, I think, a lot of his conclusions for a general audience. But knowing that he's rubbing shoulders with people like Cynthia Bourgeois and he's reading sources like Gurdjieff, and I have no idea how many others. So I've then tried to go on to read those, understanding that if that's where he's coming from, then I'm pretty sure that as one continues to spend that time with him, it is a world affirming.
Dualism. And one thing I really like about him is, and I've never done it, I don't know my Enneagram number, but I love somebody who can kind of throw back in the face those people who have their apologetics tape that the Enneagram comes from Sufi mysticism, ergo it's a tool of the devil, right?
Yeah.
And that's just too common. So I'm glad that Rohr, with his big name, has published 2 volumes on the Enneagram, and I want to lift him up and say, God bless you, Richard Rohr, for that stupid apologetics point, right?
Is this the point where I mentioned yoga pants? You know about the yoga pants thing, right?
No, I don't. Tell me.
They're from the devil.
Okay, really? Wow. Didn't know it.
It's not really flattering fashion. I just want to say that. But
along those lines, like that point of yoga, like this is again one of the things like that really pushed me to want to start something like Smart Catholics. Is one, nobody I knew was having discussions like the names that I'm putting up together and that we're talking about here, at least in Catholic circles. I don't know where they are being found, so I figure I'm just going to see what I can do to start it. But I remember one of my a collaborator, somebody else in ministry, he was terrified to publicly align himself with the Holy Father because he had a variety of suppliers who are quite avidly against the Holy Father, and he didn't want to tread on toes and so on. He dealt with a lot of traditionalist people. But at the same time, he would have an extremely anti-yoga priest come on and talk about how the whole thing is of the devil. And I'm like, you're prepared to burn bridges with these people, but not with these people. You can't do that, So as I've then, again, especially reading Tomberg, I already had like a latent appreciation for these extremely ancient wisdom traditions and so on. In a way, Tomberg for me was like the permission to keep taking it seriously. And that's one of the reasons why I love that. But to understand that there's this incredible place in history where we are now, where the global human family has been brought together. And I think my generation and the next generation is one of the first that has begun to see the world in terms of a human family.
This is an important thing. Stay with this generational piece. People will know I'm interested in that.
Yeah, and I know that you've written on this with the youth. I think that up until this past century has been, in my mind, so so radically transformative in terms of stuff like how we consider and conceive of ourselves as people. And it's been very easy before the advent of the car and the telephone and then the internet to just allow people who don't think like us to just be over there and not actually have to deal with them. Now we turn on the news and we're seeing wars happening in completely different countries, and we're able to tap into influencers who live in other countries and are sharing ideas and worldviews that we would never hear down at the local parish. Nobody lives close to the local market or their local parish. In a way, we're such a disembodied world because we live so far from things that we believe are valuable and real to us. Which is why I love both the fact that you farm and garden. But at the same time, there is this tissue, I think maybe it was Steiner who called it, that's connected us through this internet, through online communication, this ability to speak with each other, to learn so quickly, to have AI, for example, parsing petabytes of literature and data, and for us to be able to research and learn anything. I think about Thomas Aquinas and what he did to salvage and Renaissance the Greeks. And now we're at a point where I think it's the charism of the First World West to now do this again and to renew ourselves with everything else from so much else that's good from everywhere. But at the same time, there's go ahead, Michael. Sorry.
Well, I think we're ripe for Renaissance, right? As the Florentine Renaissance, even though Bergei was not a big fan of it, what was beautiful about it, the Florentine Renaissance, was that all these things you're talking about, Dominic, with taking in the wisdom traditions of other faiths, like Pico della Mirandola, he brought in the wisdom of the Kabbalah, and he brought in the wisdom of the Egyptians, Hermes Trismegistus. He brought all this stuff in, and he kind of amalgamated it and transformed it into a Christian vision. And then Luther came around, and it was game over.
Boo.
But that was a beautiful moment in history.
This is something
right? It was a beautiful in Christian history, and even with Michelangelo, right? The great image of God creating Adam. And I had looked at that in books anyway, a gazillion times through my life, until angel that God the Father has his arm around is Sophia. And that was what Michelangelo was included that there, because that's a direct quote from Proverbs 8, right? Direct quote from Proverbs 8 in painting.
Just loved reading your work and then exploring Margaret Barker. And in mowing the lawn became a transcendent thing for me after that. And just starting to just simply pray to her and recreate, so much to want to talk about. I do want to come back to one point though about wisdom tradition. I think this is something that I hunger for, because I want to understand. I want to know what's there, what's been missing, what we should be open to, and how, not just how it works, but how it's lived. And I think the one thing that has probably saved me from completely going off the rails and becoming the kind of academic that I'm terrified of has been my family. And for the last 10 years or so, my wife has been very badly sick. She had Lyme disease and so on. Has been very
so sorry to hear that.
Recuperating.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I've had to learn how to not only be a dad, but also, run the home and do all the cooking and all of this stuff. And it was actually in reading Gurdjieff that I couldn't help but laugh and had a flash of insight, where he would talk about the function of a wisdom school and of a mystery school and how they would work. And the first thing that you do when you come in is you shut up, you don't learn anything, and you go work and you dig, or you carry that rock from there to there over and over. We need to literally change out all of the cells in your body and give you fresh matter to work with, because you're currently imprinted with everything that you thought of before. We need to change all that for 2 years. During that time, we need to decenter your ego. And the guy would just, the guru or Gurdjieff would walk by and whistle or something, and then everybody had to freeze. Didn't matter what you were doing. We'll try to get around it. The point was, it would be an impossibly uncomfortable moment where you had to freeze and hold it until you fell over. And part of what that was to help you understand, you need to realize your desire to control your own body is good up to a point. Then you have to learn to let it go so that you can more freely be present in your body. All of this is sort of setting you up to begin to understand these more deeper things. But until the tool itself is refined, you're incapable of truly making sense of these things. And I read that and I felt a sense of hopeful relief in looking back at the last 10 years and realizing that's kind of been my call that I failed terribly in all kinds of ways, of little one, waking up in bed at night or crying or accidents happening or needing to just stop everything and take care of it. This has helped me to begin to see the family is of itself a mystery school, and it can teach its members all of that same training that one would get in a mystery school, because you are constantly having to decenter, to practice, to enter into that space of free and forgiving love. Like how it says, love is not just turning a blind eye to somebody's deficiencies, but sort of laughing in a sense of humor and freedom at how imperfect they are, but knowing the beauty that and the perfection that is latent there and that can be there. And
I'm so flattered somebody's reading Powys. It's great.
So we'll leave another conversation.
Well,
beautiful.
Yeah, it's great, Dominic.
What you're Dominic, before you got about the anxiety out there, possibilities of nuclear war, things I never thought would happen, right? And yesterday, somebody asked on social media, "What are you doing to prepare for a possibility of nuclear war?" And I'm like,
"You're fading a little bit again, Mike." Yeah.
But anyway, I said I chop wood and carry water.
Yeah, I saw that.
I saw that.
Yeah, I did. Yeah. So interesting, So Mike seized up a little bit there again.
Saying.
Dominic, tell me, do you, with your dad, Raymond D'Souza, I think I've heard that name. What does he think about your journey? Do you guys talk on a regular basis? So how would you describe him? I don't want to turn him into a caricature, that he's just a Raymond Arroyo, who's not an apologist, but he's just, tell me, how's this, what do you learn from that exchange?
We've been estranged for the last 10 years.
I'm so sorry to hear that. Yep. Does
he
he think you're going to hell?
I don't know. I'm sure he hopes I doesn't. I think he's probably sure I will.
What was that? Do you mind? And again, back away from anything that's too personal. I mean, was there a, where do you kind of locate the breaking point? Was it just about ideas about things?
Well, one of the things that really changed my confidence, I think, in my relationship with him was, well, a couple of different things. One of the things was, at the time, 10 years ago, my parents were going through a very sad and difficult breakup, and that led to an annulment. Okay. And for me, what was very weird and difficult about that was they'd been married for I don't know. Well, I'm 34 now. They were married for over 20, 24 or something odd years. They had 8 kids. They're both very prominent Catholics, and that then led to an annulment. And then he's also an apologist, and they're both radical traditionalists and so on. One of the things that really forced me to rethink things was the question was put to him about the new mass and whether it was valid or not. Because we're constantly in this source of tension of where do we go to mass, and can we go down the street here? And we had a friend staying with us who had no problem, who, of course, with the, I'm not even sure what it's called now, the new mass, the Pauline Rite, the Novus Ordo, I don't know what particular name is for these days. And one of my brothers asked him at one point, is it actually okay now? And his response was, it might be. I haven't had time to investigate that. I'm too busy.
Interesting. Yeah.
And for me, that I couldn't accept that, because this is supposed to be the most important thing. This, following all of the rites and the rituals to a T was the most important thing to a radical traditionalist life. You have to, the liturgy is the most important thing. And I confess, I rebelled against that. I didn't like that. It existed to the exclusion of everything else in life. And I was too creative, I think. for that, I love this scene from The Hunchback of Notre Dame, the cartoon, where it ends with, I think it is sort of I could say an embodiment of Sophia bringing the glory of the liturgy, the heart of the liturgy, out into the world. Sophia is found out in the world, and all of these characters rediscover Sophia and bring her the festivals and the liturgy to life outside the confines of the building of the cathedral.
Yeah, yeah.
I thought that was beautiful, and that really captured something.
Again, isn't there like an apologetics point there, almost to say that the word mass comes from missa, which is the sending forth,
to
right?
go, yeah,
Yeah, right.
And
we've really lost that, boy.
We've lost that ability to, I think, allow for mystery. I don't think apologetics really knows what to do with that or likes that. So,
can we all agree that it's like it's an age appropriate thing, right? I want to say it's something, you're familiar with the biological term neoteny, like you're looking for some of your guidance from science. Neoteny is the notion that you can breed adolescent traits into adulthood. So, a dog that still has its floppy ears and the tail wags, it's a neotenous wolf, right? It's a wolf that they've bred over time. The adolescent traits can go into adulthood. And you can go to, there's websites about like neoteny where some people think that's the future. You can keep young men kind of like restless and kind of happy and like not mature. And so, but apologetics, at a certain point, I think it can be a launching pad, but I do think you have to leave it behind you. It reminds me, didn't we all love it when we were kind of reading Chesterton in college or something, or right out of college for me? But eventually I think that's supposed to point to something else. And I think, when
he made it fun.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And again, was that even apologetics or not? It was a worldview. It was great. But I was interested in apologetics for a while. Then I think I still love that Sesame Street song that had every great singer in the world. You got to put down the ducky if you want to play the saxophone. Ernie wanted to play the saxophone, but he couldn't let go of his rubber ducky. And everybody was reminding him, you got to let go of one thing to move on. And apologetics should be a stage, but the Catholic Church has kind of bred it into adulthood, and maybe this can get both of you riffing. I do want to interject because it's fresh in my mind that I was clued in this whole weekend to this von Balthasar conference. And you mentioned like David Bentley Hart. There was one whole panel on apostasis. And of course they were talking about Bentley Hart and so many different panels. And I don't know if I'm going to find the words here. So again, Steiner has an evolutionary worldview, right? That we're becoming 2,000 years after the incarnation of the Logos. It's kind of residing more in us. Mm-hmm. Well, on apostasis, I always tell people, and I've written, I think I sent it to you, I've got some critiques of that book of David Bentley Hart's. But the other one is that you had some people who say at one point you had von Balthasarians that were critiquing Plato for being too general, and then critiquing St. Thomas Aquinas for being too Platonic. But right now it's all located here. So one way I'm going to phrase what I saw is that the really interesting questions that people want to hear about, like apostasis, one presenter said that, sure, we get it generally. Like, okay, God, yeah, everybody would eventually be saved. But I can tell you, I know 7 college students today who are living in eternal hell, right? They're suicidal. And okay, so we want to say eternity is not infinity. It's not infinite time. And they know that. They know that. They're stuck there. So I want to say Bentley Hart, like, when you bring it down to the personal. So this one theologian was like, all these questions about apostasis and heaven and hell, they're very personal. And I had a very visceral sense at this conference listening to a panel on this and a panel on that almost like quantum physics, where there's certain things that go below the quantum level that become unpredictable. So much of systematic theology now is there, that it's in the poetic. It really entered the poetic and the individual. And then even von Balthasar himself, like I'm really schooled in that stuff, but what he gives you is all these kind of key benchmarks, the cruciform form of the Savior, this and that. And it's like a gossamer thread that you can hold on to, and it's somewhat poetic. And it's very evanescent. You kind of get it for a while, then it just kind of evanesces. And so even that, there's not much to hold on to. But our friend that we've had on 3 times, Guido Peperata, he says we need a whole new canon. And he goes, yeah, Plato, some stuff will keep, but not much. And Aquinas, he goes, the whole thing is gone. And I have my own take on Aquinas, right? Which is that when he said it was all straw, it wasn't humility. He said it was all straw. And then Marie Louise von France, who is Jung's great disciple, she has a book out there trying to prove, and I've read the introduction, but that Aquinas, which was largely held for a long time, that when he was done with the Summa, that he wrote this alchemical tract called Aurora Consurgens. You can buy it, and there's an authorship question that hasn't been refuted. But I love the poetry of thinking Aquinas said it's all straw, and then writing an alchemical tract. And it's something that we need on this authorship question. We need more people to investigate. But I want to say that, like, with your dad and apologetics, there's something happening now that it's with the incarnation, it's going down and down, and it's very personal, that I almost felt like systematic theology kind of lost its thing. It's still too Thomistic, too Platonic. Well, we've got to find a different way of talking. And I think we're trying to pioneer it here. Does that make any sense, Michael? I mean, you're one of my closest interlocutors.
Well, I think the problem is that with systematic theology, it's just become professionalized.
Mm-hmm.
Just like all of academia, it's just professionalized and compartmentalized, and it's no longer related to anything. I shouldn't say no longer, but very often it's not related to anything that's real, which is why I also appreciated von Balthasar so much, because his turn to the poetic allows splendor, one of his favorite words, to shine through his theology, but also to show us where that we can locate that in the world. Mm-hmm. and that can be in theology, or it can be in creation, or whatever it can be in poetry. That's why he writes about all those different things. Mm-hmm. And that's when I wrote The Submerged Reality. That was my game plan right there.
Yeah, right,
because how can I show people, and that's why the subtitle is Sophiology and the Turn to a Poetic Metaphysics, mm-hmm. because we've been so stuck on a kind of rationalistic material, and even materialist when we're talking about spiritual things.
Yeah,
very dogmatic in a horrible way, right? Is the kind of manualist tradition that David Hart so often and rightly criticizes.
He has to, yeah.
Right? You do have to, because that's the crap we grew up with, Mike.
We'll be talking to like Hart in a couple of weeks. Isn't he still another systematic theologian? And I guess, I'll be reading more. I just wasn't really impressed with the Apocastasis book. It's a solid argument. It just doesn't get at the mystery of life at all. And again, force me into heaven. There's a lot of us who are kind of anarchistic and kind of libertarian. Don't force me there, bro. It just raises a lot of hackles.
You're not making me go to heaven. Yeah.
Yeah, and we get to feel elite. We get to posture that, oh no, only ignorant people now who haven't read the book or who don't get it would ever think that there's hell. And what am I doing? I counseled 2 people today in this office I'm in, who are definitely living in an eternal hell right now. The other image I got for systematic theology was kind of, and we talk about Sophia, it's like the unicorn tapestries, right? It's this massive hunt for the unicorn, and when you end it, you're going to kill it. You're going to kill it, something like that.
Mm-hmm. That's right. We murder to dissect.
Absolutely.
Right? Yeah.
So say more about yourself, Dominic. Where. How would you, let me think of a question, so you're on the Regeneration podcast. I also kind of like this generational piece. And you're also building your own website. Give yourself, and you're a brander, tell us, let Michael and I learn from you. How would you brand, just shooting from the hip, where we are and where we need to go? Is that a fair question, or is it way too open?
When you say we, you're referring to the Regeneration podcast?
No, I'm going to say speak generally. Yeah, the church and kind of young people and like where we are at this moment in time. Pope Francis, is he firing on all cylinders for you, or is he getting a lot right and some wrong?
Well, so one of the sites that I've been following and has been deeply, I think the word is germane, but I can't remember the definition. Helpful for part of my journey has been the website Where Peter Is. One of the things that they have done is really drill into what does he actually say on his own terms, and how does it, not if it does, how does it square with the Catholic thing?
Yeah.
And there's nobody else out there that I've known who's like that. And so there's one group that I've
good for them.
Not just yoked myself to, but I will listen carefully to them as well and integrate that. I love the Holy Father, and I think because my dad's from Brazil, I grew up with a lot of that Latin American je ne sais quoi, whatever the word is. And when the Holy Father speaks, it's not a problem for me to understand him or just kind of get where he's coming from. And when he's sort of flippant about these fundamentals, like, well, I know what you're saying and how you're approaching stuff. For me, it's not a big deal.
I liked it too.
So, but
I always say
think for me,
airplane interviews are the best thing out there. They drive all the neurotic people crazy. I think they're the best literature, right? When he's just shooting from the hip on an airplane. Yeah.
To your question, one of the things that for me has been, how do I say? I have a little girl, and she's about 9 years old now. And part of my challenge is I don't actually know what I want to share with her. I feel like I have drunk from so many springs. I want to know what it is I can distill that's actually going to be helpful for her, because I know I cannot give her what I was fed on.
What a great way of framing this. Continue, yeah.
So in a way, for me, there's a re-engagement with so many things that needs to happen to make sure that what I share with her is what I feel is real, and re-engagement with the real. And like Michael Martin, I sure wish I would understand what it is you have shared with your children, because I'd love to understand that. But anyhow, the other thing that's also helping me, I think, to also re-engage with the real and try to understand what is growing in me as a distinct charism for the church now is I have a beloved family member who is no longer practicing Catholic and actually can't stand religion at all. Very much the kind of, spiritual but not religious sort of thing. And in conversing, with this person a lot, what I begin to realize is not just my inability, but the inability, I think, for the church today and for religion today to make any form of connection with this person, because it is so much of a post-Christian sort of thing. And as this person is talking, all I hear is, well, the kind of things like not appropriate to say, which is, yes, you've learned this thing, but you haven't gone far enough. Yes, you're in love with science, but you haven't gone far enough. There's unsung, unread people out there like Teilhard and Steiner and Powys. You're like, and then there's stuff like epigenetics and epiphenomena and, Sheldrake, stuff like matter is not what you think it is. Spirit and matter are not this, dichotomy, whatever. The whole materialism thing, it feels so obvious, I think, to, not to put this person down, but to a child's mind. But then you have these wisdom traditions that are embracing the experience of the real, but understanding what it is, also communicating how it is this embodiment of the hierarchies and everything that Steiner and Thunberg love to riff on and talk about, and the angels. And, I'm at a loss for actually how to talk about this. And that's actually kind of part of the problem. And I think part of the solution, at least for me, is to sit with this person and not actually have all of the answers, because that's my apologetics ghost haunting me, wanting to say things clearly and accurately, and in doing so miss the pain that the person is in, and understand that they're in pain because they have been through, or they have grown up in a terrible family system that was encouraged to be that way and to foment that kind of spiritual abuse by the parish that they were in and by the kind of Catholicism and Christianity that they were given, which of course Hart would call so deeply infernalist, elitist or meritocratic or whatever. And none of this, of course, is the actual gospel, but in a way the damage has been done on so many levels. And there is so much inner work that now needs to be done, so much re-softening of the sense of self, the love of my personality. And then, well, for both of us, is the fear of death, because we fight so hard then to become free of all of these terrible things. And then, I'm still on a deadline anyway. And for me, that's been something I think that I've inherited from my own parents, is this, I mean, it's a human thing too, but this deep fear of death as an end. And this is another reason why I've fallen in love with, again, these lineup of speakers and so on, because they not only advocate, death, where is thy sting, and death is not the end, but the fact that it's human life and human living is the prelude to a much larger story, but it's the necessary proving ground for your capacity to grow in resilience and receptivity to the greater adventure of what it is to be alive, and to begin to start to see that. And again, it comes back to, well, where are the wisdom schools? That's what they're supposed to be teaching us. And so part of this is like, yes, there's lots of learning stuff that needs to happen, but then there's also, I need the silence and a little Tai Chi in the mornings to come back into my body. I need to stop watching YouTube and podcasts every time I'm cooking and play I Spy with my little girl and see where those conversations go. And what I then find is every day is like a key that is trying to unlock me to find out what it is, like, what is my contribution? Who am I? Apart from all of the ghosts that are rattling around inside of me, to begin to understand what is it that I'm actually here for, and who actually am I, apart from everything that I've imbibed from, well, everybody else and all those that I have been told or thought these are the ways to be. So, bit of a ramble.
I liked it.
That was good. Yeah. That was a great ramble. Now you're reminding me of, the responsibility of a parent, right? So how do you bring your children into this? And this is actually, when we had the conference in 2016, that was a big part of it, is because what are you going to give the kids? How is this going to become living for them?
Yeah.
And before that happened, my daughter Zelly, who's now 19, I was in the house one day and I caught her bawling. She was crying her eyes out. What's the matter? I'm just going to hell. I'm such a horrible person. I said, where did you get this?
And the Martin household, I'm
this
surprised.
book.
Oh, okay.
And what it was, Bonnie had I don't know if she was using it for anything, but it was like that lousy version for kids of the Baltimore Catechism. And Zelly, who was a precocious reader, so she was probably 5 or 6, and she was reading at probably a 4th or 5th grade level. I'm like, you're reading this? I threw it away that moment. So this is not how we're going to teach you. God is, so
that sense of, there's this scrupulosity, obviously, like this rigidity the Holy Father speaks to all the time, but there is this scrupulosity in that kind of literature. And I became very intensely scrupulous for a long time. And then this
it's so painful, Dominic. I deal with a lot of, it's so painful. Yeah.
So
I don't deal with it personally, but I've seen, again, so many young people so heavily burdened by that.
That's right. And here's the thing, guys. You're supposed to celebrate the Mass, not endure it. And everything should be that, right? This is why we do all the festivals here on the farm. In fact,
and again, it should be the anti-scrupulosity, right? That's the Sophia, like the feminine. You can't put a grid on it. The flowing, the growing, all this stuff, the real that's constantly in motion. Again, Michael said we have to divide we have to kill in order to understand.
Yeah.
That's why it's so urgent, because in an anxious world, almost any of us could be scrupulous. So it's imperative that we get the Sophianic element, so that we know that our whole thing's in motion, folks.
Mm-hmm.
I always say, you take a young college kid who's kind of OCD and you tell them there's this kind of club that'll tell you to say certain prayers on a Monday, certain on a Wednesday, that you can eat meat at this time, but not at the other time. And they gravitate towards it like flies to shit. They say, how can I sign up? But they're signing themselves up for a prison, but I asked, I'm always trying to flip the script. The problem with our priesthood right now is look at a seminary, which is so dysfunctional, and say, who would be drawn to that? We need a completely different way of training priests. But we're getting the people, the medium is the message. Michael Martin was talking about reading Barry Sanders' book that he did with Ivan Illich. But when Ivan Illich looked at schooling, it was the medium is the message. But it's a sense of urgency, which is not the liberalization. And that's where maybe, and forgive me when I mentioned like Richard Rohr or Dan Horan, at one side, when they speak, I've got 4 kids at St. Bonaventure and Dan Horan speaks for all the time. And he could just be seen as kind of a nondescript commonweal, and commonweal's fine, but just kind of this kind of bland, kind of liberal Catholic. And he's much more than that. But, we're all hungry for something that's not just the tertium quid, but truly Sophianic, and truly with the real.
This is what riveted me about, Tomberg's, tarot. And I was just rereading my highlights last night to just remember some of them, where he speaks to the great, what did he call it? The great sacred magic that Catholicism is.
And he keeps on using the phrase enzymatic, right? It's like enzymes, a fermenting, a growing thing. He's trying to create a growing in you. Yeah. He's not trying to hand on a deposit of faith, right?
This big museum, and even though the Holy Father also speaks to the church as sort of the hospital, the field hospital for sinners. I think it's wonderful, but it's another insight. Yes, it's where there's part museum going on, there's part field hospital, there's also part festival, but I think we've completely lost any sense of Catholicism being a festival, like what Martin does. But I'll confess, one of the things that I've grappled with, and again, I spent the 1 year at Christendom, and it was one of those mile markers in my life that also pushed me out of the very narrow view that I had of the world, because it did engage me with so many other wonderful people, just in my case, just real human beings, which is the first contact with the real. And then just learning things that I'd never learned before. And that opened me up to a hunger for learning. But in the 10 years since, looking back at that and looking back at things like classical education, and I've yet to thoroughly sort of vet this idea, but I think one of the problems that we're consistently stuck in is that our curriculums, of course, are based out of the last 300-400 years. And we're constantly teaching people how to think like 300-400 years ago.
Well,
they're still thinking like ancient, Greeks and so on. And this is one of the reasons why I've not really read anything by Horan except for his one book on Catholicism and emerging personhood. And he tackles Duns Scotus in a way that is incredibly compelling to me about how do we need to, it's time now to rethink what is a human being, but from a Catholic, mystic, as opposed to an ancient Greek philosopher who we now pretty much, generally accept was, not inconsistent. What's the word? It's not an adequate understanding of the human person. Mm-hmm. So constantly reading the classics, and I worked at Seton Home Study School for 4 years and did that that was my homeschool curriculum for a long time.
You've got a crazy background.
Oh, accidental world traveler. But that, again, everything in that curriculum is I'm assuming everything is always well-intended. Well-intended as it is all not just out of the last 400 or 500 years with all of its attendant problems and so on, but there's this absolute silence of renewal in catechesis, renewal in literature. It's, Michael, your points about we need a Sophia University here, like we need a whole new school, and this is what Steiner set out to go and do, and he ended up sort of blowing the roof off the cathedral and sort of let in everything that was, everything trying to come in. That's what I want to understand, and that's what I want to help bring to the world, because I think there is nothing that is more important, and otherwise we're just going to keep firing lives at each other like guns. And I think that's why the Council, Vatican II, did what it did, because after the 2 world wars, the as you said, the administration, the elites just looked at everything and thought, everything we're teaching it's just not working. I mean, everybody fighting here is all Catholic, we're all Christian, we're all emerging out of these mm-hmm. traditions. There's absolutely no wisdom tradition going on. Everything is completely depersonalized. And coming back to what we said earlier in the conversation, I think it's the greatest temptation of today to everything is depersonalized and outside of me, as mm-hmm. opposed to recentering that. And you can only do that through actually living your own life. But when is that ever encouraged or taught or shown? And I look at the last, stuff, the thing that you speak to, and the things that I have read, and wish there was sort of a light version of all of this stuff that could be given to a new generation, because this is now the first time in history that it's all been brought together It's all in a single device. I mean,
Yeah.
before the last 30 years, nobody could access this stuff. If it was buried in the Sorbonne or the Vatican archives, and this is for, I guess, for my age and my generation, the excitement for me of the future and where this can go. Because yes, things are accelerating at an incredible pace, and me and older people and so on have a hard time feeling like just staying up with things or keeping, caught up. But at the same time, I think that there's also a blessing behind the speed, because it's also going to be the fastest way that we can help provide an antidote.
Yeah. Blake
because-
called it a consolidation of error too, right?
Yeah.
The speed, it's at the last minute, it's kind of congealing so we can see its shape,
Yes.
name it, and maybe cast it out.
This is one of the funny things, and I assume we need to start wrapping here.
Yeah.
Growing up, the book that we read was called Revolution, Counter-Revolution. And it was so funny walking away from that, realizing the church does not need to be counter-revolutionary. She needs to be about renewal. Otherwise, you're always fighting a rearguard action against the proactivity of the evil side.
And artists have no role. Artists have no role in counter-revolution, do they, Michael? You're an artist.
No, and that's what you see in Rod Dreher, right?
Yeah.
I mean, as I respect him, but that's his downfall, is that bunker mentality.
Everybody's talking about Hungary now. I get it. I might rather live there than France, but it's not the answer, right? It's a rearguard action. It might be a haven in a heartless world, but
and I think we have to regenerate where we are.
Yeah.
Now, it's not, it's not some other place. You have to start where you are, right? And with everything.
Yeah.
It's, you don't wait till things are perfect. You start with what you have, with what's right in front of you.
And honestly, this sociological metaphysics, it creates a completely new view of history, and it changes the story completely. For me, the story of the last 400 years has been a frog march down to hell in a handbasket, with these successive revolutions, just nails in coffin as culture becomes progressively de-Christianized. But now I look back and realize, oh no, every single one of these revolutions was a corrective response to a calcifying of how the church has reacted with the state or created situations. And the human spirit, and I say human spirit in the loose terms, I would say it's Sophia kind of rolling over. It's never going to stay this way. It can't, because it does not incorporate the full genius of the human spirit. And of course, the emerging, Steiner would say probably the Christ impulse.
Right.
Creation not closed, but the first act of creation ended with the incarnation. Now there's a new thing. It didn't end like a billion years ago with a big bang. It began with Christ. And now we're in this amazing new phase. And I think that we still haven't caught up to that. We're still haven't caught up to that.
Yeah. Well, you're very eloquent on everything. Michael, some closing remarks or?
Well, I think I would love where Dominic ended right there, because I think that's the thing, that's the ticket, and and that's what I've been working toward. For
Christ yesterday, today, and tomorrow, right?
It's like St. Patrick's breastplate, right?
Yep.
Christ before me, Christ within me, Christ to my right side, Christ to my left side. And you ever see there's a beautiful moment in the film To the Wonder, I think it is,
seen it,
by Terrence Malick, where this priest is going through the really rough part of Oklahoma, with the really poor people, and as he's going through there, he's actually praying a version of St. Patrick's breastplate.
Yeah. You heard that the outtakes from that movie were the hit at the Cannes Movie Festival 2 years ago?
I did not hear.
No, it's huge. I'll have to look into that because you're a Malik fan.
Yeah.
Javier Bardem, right? Is that the priest who played? Yeah. So, Malik, he just films and films and films, and they splice the best things that weren't in the movie, and they're meditative. But there's hours of that stuff, Michael. You'll have to find it.
I'll find it for sure. Yeah.
So Dominic, we'll have you on again. I can't thank you enough. Again, I find you're very clear. And again, like very, very sorry to hear about the sickness of your wife. Very sorry to hear about a split with your dad. But like the clarity you've inherited from that apologetics training, you've definitely taken, the lemon and turned it into lemonade. And I'm not trying to be trite with that. I guess I was trite, but but you've kind of laying that down in a real neat way that I've certainly learned more than I've given with this. So again, Smart Catholics, do you want to give people the actual web address for that?
Yeah, smartcatholics.com. It's a a free online community. At this point, it doesn't have any of this level of discussion in it. Largely, I don't know, you could say the last 3 years have just been putting down the foundations and looking for a direction, or perhaps just giving myself the permission to accept the direction I've always wanted it to go in.
Yeah.
And I think having these kinds of conversations, and God willing, being able to serve, support, and collaborate with you, this is the kind of smart Catholic, stuff that needs to happen to get us out of our heads and then back down into our hearts, because it's not smart to stay in the top left quadrant. Of
What
the
a
brain.
great way to wrap it up. Yeah, it's not smart does not mean staying in the head. In fact, that's the opposite. Well, again, bless you and your family. We'll stay in touch. It's kind of a community here. And can't thank you enough for joining us on the Regeneration podcast. Next week, who do we have coming up, Mr. Martin? Oh, it's the Robert Powell one, right?
Robert Powell next week. Good.
Translator. Yeah, you'll have to tell me the questions you want to ask him. He's delved into astrology and so many other things, but again, the translator of Meditations of the Tarot. So again, thank you, Dominic, and we look forward to seeing our friends again next week on the Regeneration podcast. Have a good week. Yep, take care.